There are books people search for because they want answers. And then there are books people search for because they want permission. Permission to see things differently. Permission to stop believing what they've been told. Permission to stop pretending the world works the way it's advertised. The Book of Thoth was never about magic. It was about truth. Not inspirational truth, not motivational truth, but written, recorded, non-negotiable truth. And that's why it never stays found for long. Thoth wasn't just a god in the Egyptian pantheon. He wasn't a mascot. He wasn't symbolic fluff. Thoth was the god of writing, measurement, and record-keeping, which sounds boring until you realize what that actually means. He didn't create reality. He documented it. He was the one who wrote down what happened instead of what powerful people wished had happened. And in ancient Egypt, that made him dangerous. Because writing wasn't creative back then. It was permanent. Once something was written, it stopped being flexible. It stopped being reinterpretable. It stopped being adjustable to whoever held power next. Kings could lie. Priests could reinterpret. Stories could change. But written truth stayed. And once truth stays, authority weakens. The Book of Thoth was said to contain unimaginable power. Legends claim it could make animals speak, control the heavens, reveal the language of the gods. But those stories were never meant to be taken literally. They were metaphors. Because what the book really offered was something far more threatening. The ability to see patterns, to recognize systems, to understand cycles, to detect motives beneath behavior, to read the world the way accountants read numbers instead of the way poets read feelings. If you could read the Book of Thoth, you didn't gain power. You gained immunity. Immunity to manipulation. Immunity to narrative tricks. Immunity to authority that depends on confusion. And that's why every version of the story ends the same way. Someone finds the book. They read it. They understand something they weren't supposed to. And then they lose everything. Not because the knowledge was cursed, but because once you see the machinery behind the world, you can't unsee it. And people who benefit from the machinery do not like witnesses. They don't argue with witnesses. They remove them. So the Book of Thoth is buried, burned, translated incorrectly, broken into fragments, turned into myth. Not destroyed, just made inaccessible. Because destruction raises questions, but myth pacifies. Here's the part that usually gets skipped. The Book of Thoth never truly disappeared. It just stopped being called that. It reappears every time someone documents corruption, every time someone writes something that can't be walked back, every time someone exposes a system instead of an individual, and every time the response is the same. Discredit the author, mock the idea, call it dangerous, call it conspiracy, call it irresponsible, then move on. This pattern didn't start in Egypt. Egypt was just honest about it. They understood that whoever controls writing controls memory, and whoever controls memory controls legitimacy. He wrote down what you did. In the mythology, Thoth is also the mediator, the one who stands between chaos and order, but not by force, by record. He doesn't decide who is right. He documents what actually happened so reality can decide later. And that concept alone is enough to destabilize any hierarchy built on narrative control. The Book of Thoth is often described as a single object, a physical book. But that's another misunderstanding. It was never about pages, it was about method. A way of observing reality without allegiance, a way of recording without fear, a way of seeing without attachment. That's why the book keeps reappearing in different forms. They're treated the same way. Accountants get silenced, archivists get erased, whistleblowers get discredited, not because they're wrong, but because they remove ambiguity. And ambiguity is where power hides. The Book of Thoth doesn't tell you what to think. It teaches you how to notice. It doesn't accuse. It records. And that's why it's more dangerous than any weapon. Because weapons can be aimed. truth just exists. Every empire understands this eventually. That's why record keepers are always close to power, but never fully trusted. They're tolerated as long as they serve the story. The moment they serve reality instead, they become a liability. In later traditions, the Book of Thoth becomes the Emerald Tablets, then Hermetic texts, then forbidden manuscripts, then redacted reports, then classified documents, then lost emails. Different names, same pattern. What changes is not the knowledge. What changes is the audience. Most people don't want to read the Book of Thoth because clarity removes comforting lies. It removes plausible deniability. It removes the ability to say, I didn't know. That's the real cost. Not madness, not death, but responsibility. Once you see how things actually work, you're accountable for what you tolerate. And that's heavier than ignorance. The stories always warn about this. They say the reader goes mad. Seeing clearly isolates you, because you stop reacting emotionally to stories and start responding structurally to systems. And most people don't know how to relate to that. The Book of Thoth doesn't make you special. It makes you incompatible. Incompatible with manipulation, incompatible with blind loyalty, incompatible with comforting myths. That's why it's not mass-produced. That's why it's not advertised. That's why it's always framed as forbidden. Here's the uncomfortable part. If the Book of Thoth appeared today, fully intact, clearly written, undeniably accurate, most people wouldn't read it. They'd argue about it. They'd politicize it. They'd argue over who released it instead of what it revealed. And eventually, they'd ask for it to be removed. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. That's why the book was never lost. It was avoided. Avoided by people who understood that truth without narrative protection is unbearable. So the real question isn't whether the Book of Thoth exists. It's whether you actually want to read it. Because once you do, you lose the ability to pretend. And once pretending is no longer an option, everything changes. And history has shown over and over again that the world prefers mystery to accountability. That's why the Book of Thoth keeps disappearing. Not because it's hidden, but because every generation quietly decides it doesn't really want it after all.